Speaking on this program is Franklin Camp.
In Galatians chapter 5, in discussing the fruit of the Spirit, Paul said, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy. But what about joy? I do not believe it's by accident that the order is given here. Love, joy. The loveless life will be an unhappy life. There cannot be any real joy until we come to know the meaning of love and until we come to love. Without that, life will be drab and drear, and we'll rob ourselves of some of life's greatest blessing. In Psalms chapter 51 and verse 8, David's prayer, and in that there's an expression that reminds how that sin robs of joy. Listen to it. Verse 8. Make me to hear joy and gladness. David was wrong. His life was not right. Sin had entered into his life and his conscience was disturbing him. And so he said, make me to hear joy and gladness, that the bones which thou hast broken may rejoice. And so David's life was broken. The sin that he had become involved in had brought about terrible consequences. But you see, had he loved God first, had he really loved Bathsheba, he would never have become involved in the sin. Had he really loved Uriah, he'd have never had him killed. And so he failed to love Bathsheba as he should have, allowed him to become involved in sin, and because of that sin, his lack of love for Uriah led him to try to cover up that sin, and so he had Uriah killed. Now this psalm is an expression of what's happened in his life. Joy and gladness are gone. There's not any joy there. But look again at verse 12. Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation, and uphold me with thy free spirit. So David realized what's happened. He had allowed sin to enter into his life, and with that, joy had gone out of his life. He knows that the only way that that's going to ever happen is by correction, a change of direction in life, a change of attitude. And thereby he appeals that may be corrected and his life may be restored. Also, I think as we think about the subject of joy, we need to consider the fact that there are two kinds of joy. There's a joy that belongs to the world. And too many times I think we confuse this with real joy. And in so doing, we fail to understand. Listen to what Jesus said in John 16 and verse 20. Listen. Verily, verily, I say unto you, that ye shall weep and lament. But look at the rest of it. But the world shall rejoice. Can you imagine that? Jesus said, I'm going to be put to death. And whenever I do, the world is going to clap their hands in joy. And so here is a joy then that characterized people while they were doing wrong. The only thing about it, it didn't last long. I think sometimes we forget that there is a joy that the world offers. But it's not the right kind of joy. Sometimes we get caught up in that and think that this is life at its best. They thought when they crucified Christ. We'll get him out of our hair. He's plagued us all along. He's interfered with our plans. He's made it difficult for us to hold to the people, control the people. We're losing them. We're losing our position and our power. Jesus said, now, I'm going to the cross. They're going to put me there. And when I'm on the cross, there's going to be joy. For they think, then they can go on with their ways. They'll have their position and their power. And all of them come to find out that joy didn't last long. It was soon gone. That's the reason that Hebrews 11:25 talks about the pleasures of sin for a season. The joy of the world is short-lived, because joy that comes from engaging in wrongful activities brings about a reaping, the consequences that come from it. Paul, in writing to the Galatians, at the very one, in fact, the next chapter, where he mentions love, joy, very next chapter, he said, he that soweth to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. But he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. And so there is a reaping that comes from the joy that one finds in the world and that the world has to offer. And when that reaping comes, then all of that joy that one thought they had is gone. They're left then with the consequences, the harvest that comes from wrongdoing. And all joy is gone from that. So we need to realize that when Paul said, now the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, he's not talking about that kind of joy. He's not talking about worldly joy. He's not talking about the pleasure that comes from engaging in worldly activities, even though they might be right within themselves. Joy that's like that is not going to last and is not going to satisfy. But I'd like to go back to the book of Deuteronomy again and show you the problem that developed with the nation of Israel. In the first place, their failure to love God and misunderstand what it's all about led them to think that God hated them. But in that same verse, which I read last Sunday morning, I want you to notice what it says. And ye murmured in your tents. What happened? Murmuring. Murmuring is a sign of discontent, a lack of joy. And so here are these people that had been slaves, bound in Egypt. Now then, they're free. Oh, they're out in the wilderness. There are some things that are not convenient. It's not easy. But instead of finding joy and fellowship with God and the freedom that was theirs, they found themselves murmuring. I wonder if we're conscious of the fact that murmuring is wrong. Listen to Psalms 106, verses 24 and 25. Yea, they despised the pleasant land. They believed not his word. Now look at the next verse. But murmured in their tents, and hearkened not unto the voice of the Lord. That passage says that murmuring is an indication and a sign of unbelief, a lack of faith. And that our discontent, which produces murmuring, is related to unbelief. Look again, referring to the same thing in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul, in warning the church at Corinth about some things, said, "Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant, how that all of our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea. Were all baptized under Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Did all eat that same spiritual meat. Did all drink the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things were our examples, or figures, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they lusted. Neither be you idolaters, as were some of them, as is written. The people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. Neither tempt ye Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of the serpents." Now listen. "Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer." What happened? They failed to realize the importance of joy. They failed to see that what God had done for them was intended to put joy in their heart. And that joy was not based upon circumstances. It wasn't based upon the inconvenience of the wilderness. And they didn't see that. And so we are told that they murmured. But I want you to notice another verse now in the book of Deuteronomy. Going all the way through the book of Deuteronomy and coming to chapter 28, listen carefully to what Moses is going to say. Here Moses is making his farewell address to the nation of Israel. There are four of them in the book of Deuteronomy. This is to a second generation. He's warning them about what happened to that first generation. But verse 47 says, "Because they serve not the Lord thy God with joyfulness, and with gladness of heart, for the abundance of all things. Therefore thou shalt serve thine enemies which the Lord shall send against thee, in hunger and in thirst and in nakedness and in want of all things. And he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck until he have destroyed thee." Are you conscious of the importance of that passage? The book of Deuteronomy begins by saying that they murmured, showing their discontent. They were unhappy. Now then, that first generation died. Moses, in pointing this second generation to what happened, that first generation said, "They served him not with joyfulness and gladness, and they were destroyed." That ought to tell us something about what it means to serve the Lord. Now I raise the question. Am I happy? Do I find joy in serving God, or is it a burden, a load to carry, a ritual? For example, when we sing, is there in our voice and in our heart a thrill in the words that are to be expressive of the melody that's in the heart? Or are we just saying words? And it really doesn't carry any joy. When we pray, is there a thrill of joy in the fact that we, through the provision that God has made for us, have the opportunity of talking to God our Father? They didn't serve him with gladness. They didn't find any joy in it. They were murmuring and complaining and discontent. And all of that was an indication of their unbelief. Listen again. Paul, in writing to the church at Thessalonica, said, beginning in, well, let's drop back up, verse 13. For it is God which worketh in you both to will and to do his good pleasure. Now listen to this verse. All of us ought to mark it. Do all things without murmurings and disputings. Why? That ye may be blameless and harmless as sons of God, without rebuke in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom ye shine as lights in the world, holding forth the word of life, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain, neither labored in vain. Where do I find the greatest joy in life? Is it because I'm a Christian? We ought to really search our hearts. I'm not going to heaven just because I may have obeyed the gospel. If the nation of Israel was destroyed because they served him not with joyfulness and gladness, I must learn the kind of service that God expects is service from a joyful heart. And the service that does not come from a joyful heart is not acceptable to God. It took me a long time for the significance of that passage to make an imprint upon my heart. Let me give you another example now. All of us or sometimes get the idea that prophets were unusual people. They were not ordinary people. Well, that's not true. They had problems just like we do. The book of Habakkuk tells us that Habakkuk had a problem whenever he prayed, God didn't do anything about the wickedness of the nation of Israel. God said that the Babylonians was going to overrun Israel. And Habakkuk said, I've got a real problem with that. As bad as Israel is, they're not as bad as the Babylonians. And I don't know how to deal with that. So he had a problem. And God helped him solve the problem. And in the latter part of chapter 3, then there's expression of joy because he had the problem solved. But I mention that to show you that prophets can have problems. Now in the 19th chapter of the book of 1 Kings, we have an example of a prophet, Elijah. And Elijah lost all of his joy. And 1 Kings 19 tells us about what happened. And the situation was this. You recall that when Elijah came on the scene in the 1 Kings 18, he announced that there's going to be a famine in the land. And so he had to leave. And then there was a struggle between, that is chapter 17 and chapter 18, there's a conflict between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And Jezebel said, I'm going to get you alive. And so Elijah started running. And chapter 19 tells us then about some of the things that took place. Verse 3 said, And he saw that he arose and went for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongeth to Judah, and left his servant there. Now listen. But he himself went a day's journey in the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree and requested for himself that he might die, and said, It's enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers. Can you not sense the joy that's gone? He said, life is not worth living. Let me die. This shows how confused we can become when we become despondent and when we lose our joy. He said, "Let me die." He didn't really mean that. If he had stayed where he was, Jezebel would have taken care of that. He left because he didn't want to die. Jezebel said, "I'm going to kill you." If he had wanted to die, he just said, "Well, here I am, go ahead. Not anything left anyway, just let that be it." And so he really wasn't thinking too straight about that. So he said, I'm not better than my fathers. Then he lay down and went to sleep, and God fed him. The angel of the Lord came the second time, and then he went on a journey. Verse 8 says, he rose and did eat and drink, and went in the strength of that meat 40 days and 40 nights unto Horeb, to the mount of God. Then he came to a cave, and he lodged there. The word of the Lord came to him and said, "What doest thou here, Elijah?" And he said, "I've been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, and thrown down thine altar, slain thy prophet with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life and take it away." So he said, "I'm the only one that's left. Nobody else is doing right. Nobody else believes any longer. And it's down to me. And since it's down to me, I just don't find life worth living." Have you ever felt that way? Murmured and complained about it because things had gotten that rough? But you see, the thing about it is, Elijah was mistaken. Verse 11, God said to him, "Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire a still small voice. And it was so when Elijah heard it that he wrapped his face in his mantle, went out and stood in the entering of the cave. And behold, there came a voice unto him and said, "What doest thou here, Elijah?" And he said, "I've been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." Now, if you'll notice, there are a number of things, several things that Elijah overlooked. If you'll go back to chapter 17, you'll find that when the famine came, God sent him over into Gentile territory, and he found a widow, and she was fixing to eat the last thing that she had. And Elijah said, "Go and bake me a cake first." The widow did that. And we are told that the cruse of oil and the barrel of meal lasted. Elijah, how could you ever forget that? Life's not worth living when you've seen something like that and enjoyed something like that, because the circumstances now are such. Are you so unhappy and you're ready to throw in the towel? In the chapter preceding that, he had had a battle with 450 prophets of Baal, and single-handed had won the battle. At least God through him had. You remember the story. How they built the altar and the sacrifice. And the prophets of Baal tried and cried and cut themselves, and nothing happened. Elijah said, "Get some barrels of water. Pour the water around here. I want everybody to realize this is a genuine thing." They did that. Fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifice. That's a battle that he had won. But when all Israel didn't turn immediately, he became discouraged and downhearted. You see, he didn't measure like God did. And that's our trouble. When things do not turn out like I think they ought to turn out. When I don't see success like I think I ought to see success, we get real discouraged. and all the joy is gone. I remember when I was living in Montford, I preached in a meeting at Talladega under a tent. I was working every day in the store and preaching every night, and I preached for 3 weeks. 37 people obeyed the gospel. The meeting should have gone longer, but I didn't have the strength to preach any longer. So the meeting closed. Next year we had the meeting again. Crowds attended. The meeting was over, and I only baptized, I believe it was, 5 people. And I remember how discouraged I was when that was over. People would come around and say, I know what you're preaching the truth. And I thought, well, why do it? Why work like this? But as time passed on, one by one, people that heard the truth obeyed the gospel. I was doing good. I didn't know what I was doing. And in the truth of the matter, if I had never baptized anybody that attended that meeting, there was reason for joy. Number one, the opportunity to have people to hear the gospel, the opportunity to preach the gospel. And there ought to have been joy in the very fact that God had allowed me that opportunity. And so I was sort of like Elijah. But God wasn't pleased with it. I wasn't serving him with joy and gladness. And we must learn. The fruit of the Spirit is joy. Not like the world offers. It's altogether different. But it's there. It's deep and abiding. Tonight I want to talk about the fact that Jesus said, my joy. My joy. That's what he wanted to leave. That's what he wants me to have. And that's the kind of joy that I must learn about. The kind of joy that Christianity is intended to produce. Let me ask you this morning. Are you happy because you're a Christian? Are you happy in spite of the circumstances that surround your life? Or am I like Elijah, letting circumstances control me, dominate me, and rob me of the joy that God intends for me to have? It's amazing at the people that I have seen that have been happy in spite of the handicaps and the circumstances that surrounded their life. I saw a man flat on his back, worked in a mine. Rock fell on him. He had to lay in the bed 24 hours a day. And I went to see him. You'd think, well, circumstances like that, a man would be murmuring and complaining. No. I have never seen anybody that's any happier than that man was. Circumstances didn't rob him, was on the inside. He had adjusted to the situation and used his circumstances of having learned the gospel of Christ. In fact, he might not have learned it had he not had the accident. Heard Brother Nichols preaching on the radio. He was carried down to the building by an ambulance and was baptized. And in the next 12 months, he taught 5 men over the telephone and converted them. And he'd call Brother Nichols and say, are you busy? I have a man that'll be down there this morning to be baptized. That's what I'm talking about. That's what Christianity is intended to produce. Circumstances do not control our life. If the joy of Christianity is deep in our souls, and we have something to rejoice about. This morning, if you're not a Christian, you don't have any joy that's lasting. If you have any at all, it'll soon be gone. The consequences of reaping the joy of the world will be tremendous. God offers unto you the joy that Christ came to bring into the world. And it'll last. It'll follow you all the way through wherever you are and whatever circumstances you may be. Wouldn't you like to have that joy and begin to serve Him with gladness? You can, as a penitent believer upon the confession of your faith, to be baptized into Christ.